everyone, it's V from Motherhood with Me and welcome to today's vlog, my postnatal story. It was so important to me to share my story because the whole reason I set up my motherhood Instagram and my YouTube channel and began the whole vlogging process was because of my postnatal experience. I had a fairly standard birth, although very traumatic. I had forceps, an episiotomy and a tear, and the recovery from that was pretty brutal. And in that time, I realised that all of the midwife appointments that I'd had and the antenatal classes I'd attended had not covered the recovery period and what to expect. And while a lot of the things I was experiencing were very common, I didn't know how to cope with them, and I didn't know that they were common, and started to spiral, fearing that I was permanently disabled, permanently incontinent because of my birth injuries. While antenatal classes cover what might happen during birth, and they do cover aspects of the postnatal period, mainly how to keep your baby fed, how to put your baby down for safe sleep, they do not tell you what to expect from an episiotomy, what the healing process is going to be like, all of the different ways your body is going to change or, temporarily be affected by birth. It was actually through scrolling through Mumsnet for hours and hours and hours, trying to find shared similar experiences, that I realised so many people go through this and so many people are looking for the answers because they're so worried that the things that they're experiencing are abnormal, and it's already your most vulnerable time after you've just had a baby without adding these extra worries. So I was really determined that when I was ready, I was going to share my story, share my experiences, so that if it even helps one or two women who are going through that postnatal crisis of worrying that what they're going through isn't normal or that they're not going to get better, I can give them hope and help them know that they probably are going to fully recover fine without any extra interventions needed, because that's what I'm really worried about. This is part of a whole postnatal series because I didn't want to bombard you with everything in one vlog. So today's vlog is my postnatal story. It's what I went through and what I experienced. I've also done vlogs on common things that you would expect, things like your postnatal bleeding, night sweats, milk coming in, and my experience with those. Also the things they don't tell you about, things like episiotomies and tears, and incontinence and pelvic floor dysfunction. And I've also done one on all the things that I worried about postnatally versus my experience, as well as tips for recovery and all the products that I used that really helped me in my postnatal recovery. So on to my postnatal story. My birth story is on my channel, so if you are interested, please do check that out. But to prelude this vlog, what you kind of need to know is that I was in labour for 2.5 days before Luca was born. I did end up having an epidural at 7 centimetres dilated. I ended up pushing for 2 hours and then being transferred to theatre for forceps. This resulted in an episiotomy, which is a cut, and a 2nd degree tear. So my postnatal recovery obviously started at the hospital. I was transferred to the postnatal ward at around 5 a.m. in the morning after giving birth at 10 past midnight. And this was the most traumatic part of my birth because my partner had to leave me in the corridor. He couldn't come because of COVID restrictions. And I just felt so exhausted, in shock, traumatised from everything that I'd been through giving birth. Then I was wheeled into this ward, lights out because it was the middle of the night, and left with this brand new tiny baby, just in complete shock and sleep deprived because I hadn't slept for over 2 days. I hadn't eaten in well over a day and a half. So I'd been through the works, and basically from that moment I was determined to leave the hospital as soon as possible. So as I say, it was about 5 a.m. when I was wheeled to the ward. I went to sleep, and at 6:30 the nurses were coming in to do checks on me and Luca. So after 3 days of barely any sleep, I got an hour and a half, and then we got woken up. Johnny had a visiting slot at 10 a.m. to come and visit us, and I was really just counting down the minutes. I was still very shocked. And just sort of going through the motions, didn't really move. I didn't have anything with me to entertain me, but I just sat there with Luca in my arms most of the time, let people do the checks. They brought food, but I didn't touch it. I wasn't interested. They brought medicine, like painkillers, and I was told that I could probably be discharged that day. I was hoping by lunchtime originally, but there was checks that they needed to do. So they needed to check that I could wee. I had a catheter in, so that came out when Johnny was there, somewhere between 10 and 11. But he only had a 2-hour slot, so he could be there like 10 till lunchtime, and then he had to go for the day. That was it. So I was determined to get out that day. I had decided from the get-go that I was going to bottle feed, so I had the pre-made bottles and I was trying to give Luca, and he wasn't too interested, and the midwife wasn't bothered. She said that he was a big baby, he was 9'3", so he probably was okay, like he had a bit of a store and he probably wasn't like too hungry to begin with, and it wasn't a problem. So I wasn't pushing the bottles or like trying to force anything into him. So in the meantime, they said that I needed to basically do a couple of wees. They give you little cardboard tubs that you do them in, which has measurements on so they can see how much you're weighing. And I was absolutely terrified to do that, but I knew I had to do it. So I sort of psyched myself up and eventually did. And then sort of, it's a bit of a blur, but I was basically told that Johnny could come at 6 to collect us. So I'd got myself ready, I'd changed Luca into his going home outfit, even though like honestly it was at that moment like such a struggle and probably not worth it. Like, I was in so much pain, it was just a struggle to stand and change him. But I did because I had it. And then the sort of midwives swapped, and one midwife decided that Luca hadn't fed enough to be discharged, and she had a baby doctor come to see him. And it's worth mentioning waits are a long time as well. So like she said this was going to happen. The doctor didn't come straight away. Like we were waiting over an hour probably for the doctor. But Johnny was at the hospital by this point. He was downstairs. The ward was empty. So I asked if he could come up. I mean, I have to say I was like mentally just distraught. I was in floods of tears. I've never felt so close to a mental breakdown just from everything I'd been through. And I just wanted to get home. And just be comforted by like my partner. So the midwife said he could come up because the ward was empty. He sat in our little cubicle with us when the doctor came and did his checks. He said everything was fine, but he wanted Luca to eat a certain amount before he could go. So the midwife said you've got until 8 p.m. to get him to take that much. So me and Johnny just sat there like offering him the bottle, and actually once he latched onto it he took that pretty quickly, so thankfully we were allowed to leave and go home. So while we were at the hospital we had video called family to show them Luca and let them know he'd arrived. I didn't talk on any of these. As I say, I was still in a complete shock and daze, so Johnny just did the talking and me and Luca were sat in the background. But my dad was at home to greet us, and I remember just getting out of the car and walking in, and he went to hug me, and I was just like, I'm in too much pain and just I needed to go to bed. So basically he met Luca. I don't think he stayed too long, and then it was all sort of just getting ready for bed. To be honest, that night is a complete blur. Johnny did everything with Luca. He just obviously told me to rest and recover. So we got into bed and slept. He did like night feeds and got up with Luca whenever he cried. And sort of the next thing I remember is the next morning I couldn't lift myself out of bed. I just didn't have any strength to do that. Didn't have any core strength. So Johnny had to like hoist me out of bed. Being on my feet was so shaky. And actually that first moment when I got out of bed, I felt myself do a massive wee, and obviously I had a pad on so it didn't go everywhere, but my whole bladder just went and I just did a full wee. So that was the first of many shocks, and it was sort of at this point that I realised I couldn't feel my pelvic floor. And by that I mean, if you think of doing Kegels, like squeezing your pelvic floor to stop a wee, they tell you to do these to practice these. I couldn't do it because I couldn't feel it at all. And that was a real shock. It wasn't something that I'd heard of. And again, it's very common, but I did not know this at the time, so that really scared me. So I came to realise, over that morning that I really couldn't do anything for myself. My body felt like it had run a marathon. I couldn't barely climb the stairs. Johnny had to help me in and out of the shower. He had to dress me. He had to change my pads for me, like everything. It was like I'd been hit by a car or hit by a truck after running a marathon. My whole body was just in shock, and there was just no energy. Obviously days of not sleeping, not eating, and then 3 days of labour and everything that went with it had taken a real toll. But they don't tell you about this in advance, so I was really shocked and really scared. The morning after you're discharged from hospital, your midwife, your community midwife, comes and visits you in your home. So that's what happened. I think it was around between 10 and 11 a.m. the community midwife came. It wasn't my midwife that I'd seen at all of my prenatal appointments. It was one of her colleagues. I think mine was on holiday. And I just remember being an emotional mess, asking if everything was normal and, how long I should expect to feel this way. And they couldn't really give me answers. They were sort of reassuring and sort of saying, well, hopefully by the 6 weeks and all of these different things. But I was really, really scared. I mean, as well as the whole body weakness, I felt like I'd been kicked in the crotch by a horse, and this feeling repeated every time I stood up. So I'd stand up and have to brace myself because it felt like I'd just been freshly kicked. And then there was a whole host of other aches and pains. There was throbs, there was spasms, things were just sensitive to the slightest touch. All of that part of my anatomy hurt in different ways. Going to the toilet hurt. Obviously there was stinging, there was bruising, there were stitches. So all of this was going on. And I'd never heard anybody talk about it to this extent. So I was very much an emotional mess for the first few days, and they talk about, the sort of baby blues and the hormones and everything like that in the first few days as well. So there was all of this going on, and I was just crying all the time. I even had Johnny crying because he said he just hated to see me like this. So Johnny's brother and his wife are medical professionals. She is a doctor and he is a physio. And on the 3rd day, I asked Johnny if we could ring them and have a chat because I was just so distraught and so worried that what I was going through was permanent and I wouldn't heal. And if you'd asked me before giving birth if I'd ever want to talk to my partner's brother about my bits and all of the birth injuries I had, I would have thought you were mad. But when I was that desperate for reassurance, I was happy to talk to them. So we had a bit of a reassuring chat, and then he actually told me that a colleague of his from university had her own private practice in women's health physio here where I live. So he got in touch with her and she gave me a ring to chat through, what I was going through. And she reassured me, said, a lot of this is common. I needed to give it time. And she booked me in for a 6-week appointment so that she could, give me an assessment. So at least that gave me something to hold on to because I knew that I was going to see a health professional at 6 weeks. So, as I say, the midwives visit you a few times in the first couple of weeks. I attempted my first walk about a week postpartum. And I could barely manage it. So, leaving the house and just pushing the pram for 10 minutes. And it was a real struggle. And I was so shocked to still be so weak and just to not have the muscle strength for that. My community midwife, who I'd seen in all of my antenatal appointments, finally visited on day 10. And this is the day that they often sign you off, despite the fact that most people will not be healed. She said that she needed to have a look at my stitches before she could sign me off, and I hadn't let the other midwife do that thus far, and I was really against it, but she sort of insisted and said she needed to. She had a look and she basically said neither my tear or my episiotomy had healed or were healing particularly well at this point. Obviously that's the last thing you want to hear, and that set me off into more floods of tears. And she called my doctor and said that I needed an antibiotic because she thought there was a bit of an infection there. So I got my first lot of antibiotics for a week, which I took. She then had arranged to come back, but it was her colleague who came to have a look, and she said she still thought there were signs of infection, and she arranged for me to go in and see a doctor at my practice within an hour. which I did. That doctor, to be honest, didn't even want to come near me. She was in, full COVID gear, and she stood about 1 metre away from me on the bed looking. And thankfully, my community midwife hadn't come out to see me that day because she was in her practice in my doctor's, and she happened to see me in the waiting room and accompanied me into this appointment. And she had a really good idea of like what she was looking at because she'd seen the wounds pre-antibiotic. So she was sort of basically telling the doctor what she thought. And from that, the doctor prescribed another 2 antibiotics to take simultaneously and told me to make an appointment with the nurse for a review in a week's time because my midwife had to sign me off at this point. So, I mean, that really, really sucked. That was such a kick because you've been seeing this person who knows you really well and they have to sign you off even though you're not better. And that sets off another set of anxiety because no one's checking in on you. So just to add amongst this story, I was still an emotional mess every day. I was in so much pain. I was taking painkillers every 4 hours and just really, really struggling. I want to stress that because while I'm telling the process of what I went through, I want to stress like how difficult it was, how much pain I was in. I thought I was never going to heal, and I was in this like just wealth of anxiety at the time. So I was going through all of these appointments, but I was a complete mess in between them. And I just really thought, oh my God, everyone's telling me these things aren't healing well. I'm not going to heal. I'm going to be left with like this pain and all these different things forever, the stinging, and I could feel the stitches. And then I was reading things on Mumsnet about people needing operations to fix episiotomies. I was thinking that's the last thing, like, to basically have another episiotomy and redo it. It's just the last thing I can imagine. So I just want to stress like the mental state that I was in was really, really bad. And Johnny was such an incredible support. He was telling me every day that he promised it would get better, and he promised like he'd make sure that I got whatever I needed to get better. But I was still in this like despair of just thinking that I wouldn't get better. So another week goes by while I'm on these 2 sets of antibiotics, and one of them was really, really strong. It was prescribed for people quite commonly after surgery and things like that. And during this time, I was already struggling with, as I've said, sort of pelvic floor dysfunction and weakness. My pelvic floor feeling was coming slowly back, but with it, I was struggling with bowel urgency, which is where you need to run to the toilet to do a poo. You can't hold it, and it's basically coming out as you're running there. And that was really scary. And again, I was reading on Mumsnet that people would have this for, a few weeks after birth, and then things would strengthen and things would get back to normal. But again, I was just thinking, oh my God, if I'm incontinent, I'm never going to be able to leave the house again. I'm not going to be able to go back to work, and just spiraling in all of these different things. But actually what did happen on this week of these antibiotics, I think it was only a couple of days in, it was my 31st birthday. I got up that morning to make Luca's bottle because Johnny had done the whole night, and basically the way we worked it was he did the whole night. I then took over for a few hours in the morning while he had a few hours of undisturbed sleep. And I had everything set up downstairs, so it was very minimal physical work for me. So I was making Luca's bottle and I felt the urge that I needed to go to the toilet, and I didn't make it. And basically it was really strong diarrhea from these antibiotics, and my muscles weren't strong enough to hold it. So I ended up walking into the bedroom, crying my eyes out on my 31st birthday and waking Johnny up saying, I've just shit myself. And he jumped up and said it's okay and helped me sort it out, but I was distraught. Let me just add that this is so uncomfortable for me to share this, but I'm so passionate about doing that because, as I keep stressing, I was in such a dark place going through all of these super unpleasant things, and so I need to be honest about it for anyone else who's going through it. 1, it's not shameful, and 2, it is most likely going to get better, and that's the whole reason that I'm sharing this. So I went for the nurse review a week after these 2 lots of antibiotics. And she firstly was telling me that this, episiotomies and tears aren't things she sees very often, very much making it sound like she didn't really know what she was looking for. but she had a look and she told me that my episiotomy had a hole in it, so part of it had healed and part of it hadn't. From reading Mumsnet, I knew that it was really common for people's wounds to open or seem to open, because basically the stitches only last 7 to 10 days and then they drop out. And this is really common, but again, something you're not told in advance. And when that happens, it doesn't get restitched. They leave it to granulate and to heal itself. But again, if you've just given birth, you've just had stitches down there, and then you have a look and see a hole, you're going to panic. So the nurse went off to speak to a doctor and came back and said that I needed to be referred back to the hospital to be checked. Obviously, I was in such a emotional place that the last places I wanted to be again was hospital or anything like that. I just wanted to be told that I was getting better, and I felt like I kept being kicked when I was down. So hearing this was not good news. But she told me that she'd referred it back to my midwife, who would refer me to the hospital. And this didn't make sense to me because I knew my midwife had signed me off. So the next day I phoned the community midwife base and they confirmed that my midwife wouldn't be able to do anything. I was no longer her patient, and advised me to go to A&E, which I really did not like the sound of, just walking into A&E about my episiotomy. So I decided to ring MAU, the maternity assessment unit, and explain the situation, and thankfully they told me that I could go in and be seen by a gynecologist that afternoon. My partner could join me. So as much as I didn't want to, I was so sick of getting my bits out. I thought birth would be it and that I'd be done with getting my bits out. I went in and saw a doctor there. This was the first time that I've seen a male doctor, and that in itself added an extra layer for me. I felt just really shy and uncomfortable, but there's nothing you can do about it. So this male doctor had a look and he actually laughed and said, no, there's no hole, but basically the episiotomy hadn't healed particularly well. So it healed with the inside skin outside, which would be very sore, and he said that this could take months to sort of firm up and become outside skin and not be sensitive. And this felt like more bad news, like I'm going to be sore for months. And then he asked me, was I planning any more children? Which only a few weeks after giving birth, very traumatically, still healing, I really couldn't answer that question. It felt like a very insensitive question. And he basically said he was asking because they can sort of do this Fenton's procedure, it's called, where they cut and restitch the area if it hasn't healed right, but they only like to do that after you've finished having children, which just seems like such a ridiculous thing to say. So basically you have to live in pain until you're done producing children. But I sort of just brushed all that off. I was like, I'm in no place to make that decision, and I really hope that I don't need to have this operation. So at this point I was being told that my episiotomy had a hole, didn't have a hole, hadn't healed, had healed wrong. As you can imagine, I was just in, such a confused, despairing place. I felt like I couldn't trust anyone, what they were telling me, because it was all conflicting. And I was still in loads and loads of pain. And I also still had the tear. And everyone had been focusing on the episiotomy at this point, not the tear. But the tear was actually really tucked, sort of tucked under my left bum cheek, and you couldn't see it. Just looking at the episiotomy, you couldn't see the tear. You really needed to lift my left bum cheek to see the tear. So that was left. I was still in a lot of pain every day, taking painkillers, but I knew I had my 6-week appointment with my physio coming up. So this was a private appointment with the physio who my brother-in-law had suggested and recommended. And honestly, I went into that appointment a complete mess. I told her everything that had gone on, everything that I've spoken about in this video. And, I was still walking like a cowboy. I couldn't sit on hard chairs. I couldn't put anything tight on, like jeans. I couldn't imagine ever having sex again, ever. And I really just offloaded all of this onto her. And I was in such a bad place. And I said, I'm never going to have any more children because this has been so horrendous. And I'm probably never going to be able to have sex again to conceive any more children. I basically felt like I had ruined my life just by having a baby. And how crazy is that? Because I was still in so much pain and I still felt disabled. I still felt unable to walk, I wasn't driving at this point. I had to sit on really fluffy cushions to do anything. So I was really, really struggling at this appointment. So she obviously said, I'll have a look and see what's going on. Now, obviously, we're told this magic 6 weeks. This magic 6 weeks is when you'll be completely back to normal. That's what they make it sound like. And at this point, I was at 6 weeks. I was far from back to normal. And so I got onto the bed and let this physio, another person, have a look. I was so sick of getting my bits out. And she immediately started making not pleasant noises like ooh and and I was just like, oh God, what am I going to be told now? And she basically said that the tear had not healed. The episiotomy looked fine, but she said, yes, still sore scar tissue, but it had healed, but the tear hadn't healed. So I was suddenly in a whole new place where nobody had really looked at the tear for a good few weeks. Everyone had focused on the episiotomy and the tear hadn't healed. So she was actually in two minds of whether I should go back to the hospital. It looked that bad to her, and she sort of really looked at it, and then she said, well, I don't actually think much they'll do. I don't think it's infected. You've had all the antibiotics. She took a picture. She took a photo on her phone and emailed it to me so that we could track the progress. So that was lovely. And basically she said the way the tear was, it was like week 1, and I had another 6 weeks of healing to do. So she booked me back in to go in at 6 weeks for that. In the meantime, I had my 6-week GP appointment, which was actually at 7 weeks, but I got it booked. And in that appointment, I was still very emotional. I told him what the physio had said, how my tear wasn't healing, and he phoned the hospital and they said the on-call gynaecologist would see me if I went straight there. So back to the hospital I went and saw another male gynaecologist. This time Johnny couldn't come in with me, and honestly it was all just so traumatic for me. He had a look and he said, yeah, it hadn't healed, but it would. I had to give it to 12 weeks. So I had a new bench post from what the doctors had said, a new goal post of 12 weeks, and then, would re-review it then. But he said these things like they take time and it should heal on its own. So I went home with this new knowledge, and I was still on daily painkillers. I was still really struggling to do anything. At 8 weeks, I booked onto baby classes, and I drove for the first time, still with thick padded cushions, but that was, a small victory, and small victories are what you need. And actually over that 6-week course of baby classes, so from 8 weeks to 14 weeks postpartum, things rapidly improved, vastly improved, and I can really measure the sort of change over that time. The first couple of classes I couldn't sit comfortably at all, because of course all baby classes are on hard wood flooring, and by the end of the 14 weeks I was a lot more comfortable. I also had another review of the physio who said, my tear still, when I saw her I was 12 weeks, my tear still hadn't fully closed, and at this point I was looking at it myself every day, so I knew exactly what it looked like, and it hadn't fully healed. I'd been using something called Medi-Honey on it, which the physio advised, and I genuinely think this made a massive difference. It coats it to stop it from getting infected, and it promotes healing, and it helps scar tissue, and honestly I think it made the world of difference. So my tear was improving, but it wasn't healed. She said things were a lot better. She said, try not to look at it, every day anymore. Try to just give it time. And this actually coincided with us having plans. From 12 weeks, we had postponed pre-COVID plans, which included going to several concerts and travelling to Glasgow and London. So I was obviously really apprehensive about these things. And I was still struggling with the incontinence, the bowel urgency. And Johnny basically said, we'll get you incontinence pants, whatever's going to make you feel better. It's like reassurance, isn't it? So I went off to these different things and just getting the train and going to concerts. And while I wasn't my full self, at least I was getting out there and I was doing things. And things that 12 weeks ago I never would have imagined I could. So somewhere between 14 and 15 weeks, I hadn't looked at my tear because I'd been busy. I'd stopped putting the Medi Honey on it every day. I was still using it a bit. One day I looked and the tear had healed. It was closed, there was no longer a hole, and oh my god, I just didn't imagine it would ever happen, and that day was amazing. Don't get me wrong, scar tissue, still sore, still tender. I am now 7 months postpartum and my scar tissue still isn't 100%. There's still, times that it's tender. I still have sore muscles at times. When I get my period, that whole area is so much more tender than it ever was before. But, there's been a vast improvement. I am not incontinent. The bowel urgency is massively improved. I've been doing a lot of pelvic floor exercises since seeing the physio. She gave me pelvic floor exercises to do using the Squeezy NHS app. So obviously I've been working on my core strength, I've been working on my pelvic floor, and everything has very slowly but surely improved and got better, like so many people on Mumsnet said it would, like different doctors said it would. But as you can see, it was such a long, hard road to recovery. I certainly did not recover in the magic 6 weeks. I was not back to myself. I still don't feel back to myself, but I am getting there, and I do know now that I will get back to myself. So I really hope that me sharing this journey, whatever stage you're at postnatally, if you're struggling with tears, with episiotomies, with birth injuries, with pelvic floor dysfunction, with just pain and suffering and not feeling like yourself, this gives you real hope that you will get there. Thank you so much for watching this video. If it's helped you, or if you think my other videos will be helpful to you, it would mean a lot if you could subscribe, just so that I can see that I'm reaching people who this is helping, or give this a like. And if you have any questions at all about my postnatal recovery, please do post any questions in the comments and I absolutely will get back to you. You can also private message me on my Instagram, Motherhood with Me, and I'd be so happy to chat with anyone about any aspect of their postnatal recovery or motherhood. So please do drop me a message if that would be helpful to you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.